If you're gonna work for me, you'll have to do something.
You can work for me, on one condition, and on the same morning I needed money to keep my grandmother alive, the mob boss told me to kneel. 3 women had accepted before me, one crying, one trembling, one praying. I laughed in his face. I figured Adonis Vance would have me dragged out of that freezing building in the loop. Instead, he signed my contract as if I had done exactly what he expected. But what froze my blood wasn't the order. It was realizing that, walking into that world of closed doors, armed men, and dangerous silences, maybe kneeling had been the easy part. Because the real fear wasn't working for Adonis Vance. It was finding out too late whether he had hired me to save me, or to never let me leave. Hi, I'm Lena. A special shout out to those of you watching Book 1 for free here on the My Stories platform, completely ad-free and uninterrupted. Chapter 1, 11 Days to Lose My Grandmother. 5 in the morning in Bridgeport, and the radiator was knocking out its usual rhythm. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 knocks. I'd been up for half an hour, the kitchen table covered in coins, quarters in 3 stacks, dimes in 2, a handful of nickels I pretended still counted as money, $37.85. The bus fare came out of that. The rest had to cover the fridge through Friday. The cold came in through the 5th floor window like the window didn't exist, and I cinched my robe the way I always did, the knot at my waist pulled tighter than it needed to be. The smell of reheated coffee from the night before still hung in the air, mixed with the smell of the sink that needed new dish soap. The yellow bulb in the ceiling flickered now and then, and I'd learned not to look up when it did. I reached for the landline, because I saved the cell phone for emergencies, and dialed the hospital. The night shift nurse recognized me by my voice before my name. Aubrey, sweetheart. She had a good night, coughed twice, fell back asleep. And the payment? There was the pause I'd been dreading. The nurse shuffled papers, dropped her voice, and when she came back, she was using the tone she saved for not hurting me on purpose. 11 days, honey. Administration was clear. Without the payment, she loses the private room. She goes into the general ward. General ward, for an 80-year-old woman with heart failure, was the polite way of saying Maeve would be gone before summer. I squeezed the corner of the counter until I could feel the Formica edge digging into my palm, and the cold of the metal sink mixed with the cold inside my chest. I'll handle it. I hung up before my voice could betray me. Handle it was the word I'd been using since I was 16, when Maeve got sick the first time, and I understood pride was the only thing no one could take from me as long as I had hands to work with. I went back to the table, counted the coins one more time, and this time I came up a penny over. Funny how math insists on lying in favor of not enough money. I showered in water that was almost cold, because the water heater was a weekend luxury, and I walked down 5 flights with the gray blazer in my hand. The bus to the loop was packed, fogged up on the inside, with the cheap coffee smell of people who also got up before the sun. I rested my forehead against the glass and closed my eyes for 2 blocks. Maeve, in my head, was still serving Sunday pancakes with both hands. The office was on the 18th floor of a glass building that cost more in monthly tax than my salary for 4 years combined. I'd been working there as a legal secretary since I was 22, handled 3 partners, knew where every comma in every contract sat, and where also each of the partners' hands tended to land during office parties. I'd learned to dodge with the grace of someone who needed the job. Donovan, the senior partner, was the worst of them. Mid-50s, 2 divorces, 1 Italian suit per day of the week, and a habit of calling the interns into the break room when the coffee ran out. That Friday, it was me. Aubrey, give me a hand with the espresso. Machine's acting up again. I already knew the machine wasn't acting up at all, but I went in anyway, because there were still 11 days left, and any day of salary I lost was 1 less morning in Maeve's private room. He shut the door behind me. I heard the click. "You should smile more, you know that?" Donovan said, dropping his voice like confidence was an excuse. A pretty woman walking around the office scowling. It brings the mood down. He put his hand on my neck first like it was affection. Then he squeezed. His thumb climbed to my chin. I caught the whiff of 11 a.m. whiskey on his breath. The break room wall was cold against my back, and for a second, 1 single second, I thought about letting it go. 11 days. Maeve. The general ward. Then he laughed, and laughing was his mistake. I drove my elbow into his throat with all the force of 4 years of swallowed crap. Donovan doubled forward, let out a sound like an animal, and I ducked under his arm with the calm of someone who'd understood in that second that losing the job hurt less than staying in that break room. I walked out with the sleeve of my blazer torn, a button hanging by a thread, and the print of his thumb burning on my skin. "You won't work in another office in Chicago ever again," he shouted from the doorway, his voice still raspy from the pressure of my bone. "You hear me, Halloran? Never again." I didn't answer. I got in the elevator, hit the lobby, leaned against the mirrored wall, and only there did I realize I was shaking. It wasn't fear, it was rage. Rage at the sheer crassness of being treated like a buffet plate in a hallway where I had typed, word for word, $1,000,000 contracts. I pressed the torn blazer against my chest and counted to 10. I got to 8, and the elevator opened. The reflection of the woman in the mirror in front of me didn't look like me. Her chin was lifted, her hair darker than I remembered, and her eyes were the eyes of someone who had just closed a door for good. The bus back to Bridgeport felt slower than the one that morning, and the window fogged up again, and I thought about Maeve in the private room with the little TV up on the cabinet, watching Mexican soaps with the volume turned all the way down. I climbed the 5 flights, chewing the inside of my cheek. I opened the apartment door, and the landline was already ringing. "Everything's great, Gran," I said, before she could ask. "Left early. Slow Friday. Your voice sounds funny." "I'm stuffed up." "You don't get stuffed up, Aubrey. You get stubborn." I laughed. It was the first good thing of the day. Maeve coughed on the other end, coughed 3 times, and the nurse took the phone from her with the manner of someone following protocol. I hung up. I set the receiver in its cradle slowly, sat down on the kitchen floor between the coins I hadn't even put away, and cried. Not pretty movie crying. Crying with my nose running, with the torn blazer in a heap by the fridge, with my knee bent against my chest until it hurt. The linoleum was freezing through the robe, and I didn't have the strength to get up. My cell phone buzzed in my pants pocket. I thought about ignoring it. It was an unknown number, the kind that usually meant collections, but it buzzed 3 times in a row, and I unlocked the screen. Voice note from Sloan. "Hal, listen. I heard about the circus in the break room, and before anything else I want you to know I reported Donovan to HR a few minutes ago, with first name, last name, and the number of his tie. It'll go nowhere, but I did it for me. Now for the love of God call me, because I need to laugh, and the only joke in my life is you." I laughed, on the floor, my face wet, and the laugh came out louder than I expected. Sloan always knew how to drag a laugh out of me by the hair. I was about to call her when the screen lit up again. Another unknown number. This time, a text. "Personal executive assistant. 6-figure salary. Absolute discretion. Interview Monday, 9 a.m. Address in the loop. Confirmation at the number below." I read it 3 times. 6-figure salary. Absolute discretion. I'd seen scam ads before, and the scam ones came with model photos and promises of international travel. This one came in a clean font. No emoji, no enthusiasm. With the address of a building I recognized because one of the firm's clients had an office on 15. Serious building. Marble in the lobby. Doorman in a blazer. A chandelier that by itself was worth a year's rent in Bridgeport. I knew what an ad like that meant. Pretty woman, high salary, absolute discretion. Sloan, in her eternal joke, would translate it as mistress to a married man with health insurance. But 6 figures were 6 figures, and 11 days were 11 days, and Maeve was Maeve. I got up off the floor. I washed my face at the kitchen sink because the bathroom was on the other side, and I didn't have the legs for it. The cold water on my skin burned in a way that was almost good, like it was pulling something out of me besides the salt of tears. I looked at the bruised thumbprint that was starting to come up on my neck, in the cracked little mirror hanging above the faucet. I smiled without humor. I texted the number back. Confirmed. Monday, 9 a.m., Aubrey Halloran. The reply came in 15 seconds. Received. That was all. Received. No welcome, no instructions, no request for a resume. Who answers a candidate in 15 seconds on a Saturday without asking age, qualifications, or availability? I shut the phone and went to the bedroom. I opened the top dresser drawer and dug, in the back, under the socks, for the little red can of pepper spray Maeve gave me the day I moved into the apartment. "It's not for using, honey. It's for having." A woman carries pepper spray in her purse the same way she carries lipstick. I put the spray in my black bag, the only presentable one left in the closet. I also put in my grandfather's pocket knife, which I'd never opened in my life. The dark wooden handle had the wear of a lifetime of calloused hands, and I ran my thumb across it like someone praying without words. I looked at the 2 of them in there, side by side, and made a promise in a low voice, as if Maeve could hear me from her room. "If it's a trap, I'm going out with my teeth in something. I hung the torn blazer over the chair. Tomorrow I'd sew the button on. Sunday I'd spend the night with Maeve at the hospital, pretending everything was fine. Monday, 9 a.m. I'd walk into a building I didn't know to meet a man who paid 6 figures. I sat on the edge of the bed, the closed bag in my lap, and stared at the wall for a while without seeing anything. Outside, the late afternoon sun was starting to drop between the buildings, painting the kitchen linoleum orange. The radiator knocked again. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 knocks, as if confirming what I already knew. The world was going on the same, but something, somewhere, had just shifted on its axis. Chapter 2. Start on your knees. Monday morning, the wind off Lake Michigan was cutting down Michigan Avenue like it was charging a toll. I got off the train at the Loop station, walked 3 blocks with the pepper spray knocking against the lining of my bag, and stopped on the corner of the building 2 minutes before the hour. Dark glass, black marble in the lobby, no name anywhere on the facade. The serious buildings in Chicago announced themselves by their absence. This one was serious. The doorman recognized me before I said I was there for the interview, which should have been the first warning. He checked a screen, gestured to the elevator at the back, and the elevator went up on its own without my pressing a button. 28th floor. The doors opened onto an anteroom where the AC was set to meat locker. 3 women were already waiting, seated in 3 identical armchairs, with 3 identical folders on their laps. None of them looked at me. The one on the left, blonde, had her lipstick in the exact shade of her nail polish. The one in the middle was praying softly, a rosary hidden between her fingers. The one on the right had the red eyes of someone who had already cried in the bathroom. I sat in the 4th chair, set the bag between my feet, and only then did I notice the men. 2 by the glass door, 1 in the back near the window, all with discreet earpieces in the right ear, and the left hand resting near the hip, with the manner of men who knew what they had holstered there. They weren't bank guards. I swallowed hard. The blonde with the lipstick was called in first, walked through the double door at the back, came out 12 minutes later with the expression of someone who had just stepped out of a confessional. The one with the rosary went next, took 9 minutes, walked out sniffling. The one with the red eyes was in for 7 minutes. She came back without crying. None of them traded a glance with the next. Miss Halloran. The voice came from the double door, from a tall man in a graphite gray suit with the posture of someone who had been military before this life. I stood. I crossed the rug. Too thick. The door shut behind me with the same click as Donovan's break room last Friday, and I held my breath for a second before I lifted my chin. The room was enormous and almost empty. A dark wood desk in the middle, 2 chairs on one side, 1 on the other. A floor-to-ceiling window with all of Chicago down below, gray with winter. Behind the desk, 2 men. The one on the right was older, 60-something, with white hair cropped short, and an open smile like a man with small grandkids waiting at home. Beige cardigan under the jacket, his hand resting on the desk in a sign of peace. The kind of man who offers candy to a child on the train. The one on the left was something else. Black pants, white shirt with no tie, 3 buttons open at the collar, eyes the color of rain, and I'm not being poetic. It was that November gray when the lake disappears under the cloud, dark hair with a thread of silver at the temple too soon. He must have been 34, maybe 35. He wasn't smiling. I recognized the man before the name reached my head, the way you recognize a word you've heard whispered for months without knowing how to spell it. Adonis Vance. The name the lawyers at the firm pronounced clenching the air between their teeth. The Don of the Chicago Camorra. The man who had inherited an empire at 24, on the same intersection where he buried both his parents. The blood drained to the soles of my feet. For a second I thought I was going to sit before being invited to, just because my knees were warning me they were about to give. But Maeve, in my head, said the same thing she always said. Chin up, baby. It's the only thing nobody can take from you. I lifted my chin. I gripped the strap of the bag where the pepper spray was waiting, not knowing it had walked into the worst meeting of its little tin life. Miss Halloran, the older one's voice, warm, slow, honey over a knife. Cassian Vance, consigliere of the house. Please, sit. Consigliere. I knew what the word meant. I had typed it into a contract once without understanding, and had looked it up afterward. The family's advisor. The second man. The first one still hadn't spoken. He was sitting there, forearms resting on the desk, the signet ring shining low on the pinky of his right hand, a flame engraved in the metal. He was looking at me the way you check that an ordered piece arrived in one piece. I sat. I set the bag on my lap. My hands felt like they belonged to someone else. Adonis leaned in half a centimeter. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, calm, the tone of a man who had never had to raise his voice to be obeyed. Every woman who works for me starts on her knees. He pointed at the floor between my shoes with the same finger. I went 2 seconds without understanding. Not because the sentence was complicated, but because a part of me was still insisting on translating it into something acceptable. Prayer knees, oath knees, knees for some mob ritual I'd never heard of. Then I remembered the 3 women in the anteroom. The lipstick one, fast. The rosary one, crying. The red-eyed one. Oh, the blonde had knelt in 12 minutes. The rosary one, in 9. The last one, in 7. They were getting more efficient. I looked at the floor between my shoes. I looked at the signet ring. I looked at the rain-colored eyes, which were still parked on my face without blinking, without smiling, without expectation. There was no lust in that sentence. There was no provocation. There was cold ritual, the same as sending the intern to fetch coffee on the first day to see if she takes the order. I felt the corner of my mouth go up before my head approved it. It was small. It was short. It was a 2-syllable laugh, the kind I saved for Sloane when she went too far. If you want someone to kiss your ass, hire a dog. It's cheaper. Silence. It was a different silence from Donovan's break room. That one had been a silence of fear. This one was surprise, as if the whole room had forgotten to breathe at the same time. Cassian, on the right, lost the smile for the first time. I watched the kindly grandpa expression slide off his face like fresh paint. His eyes hardened for 1/10 of a second before his mouth rebuilt its curve. When it rebuilt, the curve was different, thinner, more attentive. Adonis Vance, on the left, didn't harden at all. The opposite happened. He leaned in another half centimeter, and the rain gray of his eyes moved for the first time, like the cloud had passed over the lake. He looked at me as if I were the first person he had seen walk into that room in 11 years. Not with shock, with recognition. I couldn't name it at the time. I just registered the sense that someone in front of me had waited his whole life to hear that exact sentence. Cassian. His voice was still low. The contract. Adonis. The contract. Cassian opened a black leather folder. He took out 3 stapled pages. He laid them on the desk, with the kindly grandpa smile already fully reconstructed, and pushed them toward me with the tips of his fingers. 6-figure salary as advertised, Cassian said sweetly. Health insurance with private coverage for 1 dependent. Commuter benefits, although you'll be picked up every day. Picked up every day. I didn't even ask why. I had more questions in my mouth than air to support any of them. Adonis took a fountain pen from the inside pocket of his jacket, dark metal cap, the kind that has weight in your hand. He signed on the bottom line without reading. Didn't check a clause. Just signed, returned the pen to his pocket, and pushed the pages 1 more finger width toward me. Start Monday, he said. 7 sharp. The car picks you up at your address. I stood. My legs obeyed. I took the 3 pages by the edge, folded them in half without reading either, and stuffed them in the bag, next to the pepper spray. My grandfather's pocket knife was at the bottom, and I thought, with a slightly drunken clarity, that those 2 objects looked ridiculous now. Miss Halloran. Cassian, still in the smile. Welcome to the house. I didn't answer. I walked to the door with the same posture I had come in with, chin up, bag strap on my shoulder, and only at the edge of the rug did I realize Adonis still hadn't taken his eyes off me. I felt my whole back before the door closed. In the elevator, alone, with Chicago dropping away outside the glass, I looked at the reflection and laughed. It was a short laugh, no joy in it, my heart still beating in my throat. I laughed because the alternative was to start crying inside the elevator, and an elevator was no place to cry twice in the same week. I walked out of the building. The wind hit me in the face, and I thanked the wind. I walked 2 blocks before pulling the phone out of my pocket and calling Sloane. She picked up on the 3rd ring, her mouth full of something. Hal. Talk. Sloane. I just got hired by a man who told me to kneel. She stopped chewing. Did you kneel? I told him to hire a dog. There was a 3-second pause. Then Sloane screamed so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear, and 2 people on the sidewalk looked at me. Aubrey Halloran, you gorgeous madwoman, I love you, I adore you, and I'm going to tell you one thing only once. Girl, personal executive assistant to a rich man has 2 meanings, and the bad one is the one that pays more. Stay alive, please. I am not joking. I laughed. This time it was a real laugh. A few months, Sloane. I can do a few months. Pay off Grant's debt. And vanish. 3 months. 3 months. Hal. What? You're not going to vanish. I hung up without answering. I crossed the street against a cab that braked and cussed me out in 3 languages. I walked into a corner cafe, ordered a coffee with 2 sugars and declared disgust, and sat by the window. I took the contract out of the bag. I opened to the first page. The words were all in order, in a legible font, with clauses laid out in paragraphs like little soldiers, salary, insurance, hours, dependent, all neat, all respectable. Just one line, in the footer of the 3rd page, made me stop for 2 seconds. In smaller type, after his signature and the space reserved for mine, supplementary record on file in a parallel archive, in accordance with the tradition of the house. I had no idea what a parallel archive was. None of the secretary contracts I had typed in the last 4 years had a footer about a parallel archive. I made a mental note to look it up later, at home, calmly, the same way I had looked up consigliere months earlier. But a footer was a footer, fine print, in a serious building with a dangerous man, on the day my grandmother had 11 days to lose her room. I wasn't in any position to question anyone's footer at that table. I folded the contract, put it back in the bag, drank the coffee to the bottom, making a face with every sip like it was medicine. I stood, caught the bus back to Bridgeport, leaned my forehead on the fogged glass, closed my eyes, and thought about 3 months. 3 months, pay off the debt, vanish. Chapter 3. The House That Eats with Its Head Down. The house in Lincoln Park had ceilings too high for a woman from Bridgeport. I noticed it the first morning, when Declan stopped the car at the side entrance, opened my door with a curt nod, and said, "This way, ma'am." 4 words. That was his speech budget per chunk of time, and I figured out quickly there was no point trying to stretch him. Declan had a thick neck, a well-cut black suit, and 2 bricks where an expression should have been. When I thanked him, he answered, "You're welcome," and that was it. The house smelled of old wood and freshly brewed coffee. There was an undertone of floor wax, an almost imperceptible trace of cold tobacco coming from the study upstairs, and, near the pantry, the warm, sweet smell of bread someone was kneading in the morning without my ever seeing who. Heavy rugs, wide hallways, portraits I couldn't identify hanging on the walls in gilded frames that looked older than I was. On the 2nd floor, at the end of the east corridor, there was a door that was always locked, and halfway down that same corridor, a painting covered by a black cloth, the size of a window, that nobody commented on, and nobody took down. In the first week, I asked Declan what was behind the cloth. "Don't ask," he answered without breaking stride. "Don't ask either." I didn't ask again. Adonis's personal calendar was a disaster organized by men who had never learned to use a spreadsheet. I reorganized everything in 3 days. Meetings in codes I pretended not to decipher. Dinners with names that showed up in the papers. Discreet doctors who made house calls. Lawyers who came in the side door. On my own, I canceled a lunch with an alderman who had called 3 times that morning. Drafted the response to a notary in Brooklyn without consulting anyone. Screened out 2 contacts who insisted on talking to him directly. I scheduled, confirmed, canceled, served coffee. Served a lot of coffee. I learned fast that the house ate in silence. Adonis sat at the head of the big dining room table and lowered his head before the first bite, like a boy in trouble who had been told to pray and didn't know the prayer. He didn't talk during the meal. He didn't lift his eyes. He chewed slowly, with impeccable posture that contradicted the position of his head, and when he finished, he folded the napkin into a precise square and walked out without saying anything. I started reading that silence without meaning to. It was an old silence, with a child's stitching in it. It wasn't the silence of someone with nothing to say. It was the silence of someone who had never been invited to say anything. He watched me reading, and neither of us mentioned it. The second Sunday, I came down the stairs with his cup in my hand and stopped in the kitchen doorway because there was blood on the floor. Not much. A puddle the size of an apple, dripping from a folded cloth on the marble counter. The iron smell mixed with the smell of alcohol, and underneath it all, a trace of reheated coffee no one had thought to turn off. On the counter was a curved needle, black suture thread, alcohol, and a guy of about 20 sitting in a wooden chair with his shoulder out of his shirt, his face colorless. Adonis was standing behind him, sleeves rolled up to the elbow. His right hand held the needle, and his left was bracing the guy's shoulder, steady. The signet ring with the engraved flame was shining on his finger in the light from the window. He saw me in the doorway before I had decided whether to go in or back out. His hand trembled. It was fast. A fraction of a second in which the needle paused in the air, and his wrist drifted 1 millimeter to the left. Adonis hid the tremor by fitting his hand into the kid's shoulder, as if the gesture was to steady the stitch, and looked at me from below, his head still tilted slightly. "The doctor couldn't come," he said. Low voice, no apology. "Almost done." The kid tried to turn his face in my direction. Adonis locked his chin with his left palm. "Don't move." I stepped into the kitchen. The cold tile came up through the thin sole of my shoe. I didn't say good morning. I didn't ask his name. I set Adonis's cup near his good hand, on the corner of the counter where he could reach without leaning, and opened the cabinet where Declan kept the sugar bowl. I poured another cup, and 2 spoons of sugar went into it before I thought about what I was doing. Adonis tracked the motion out of the corner of his eye. I saw his eyebrow lift 1 millimeter. Distaste, recognition, something like shock. I set the sweet cup in front of the kid, on the low table next to the chair. "Drink," I said, slowly. The kid looked at Adonis first, asking permission. Adonis nodded, slowly, without stopping the stitching. I sat in the other kitchen chair. I didn't leave. I stayed there until the last pass of the needle, holding the kid's cup when his hand was shaking too much. Adonis stitched in absolute silence, and the only thing you could hear in the house that afternoon was the tick of the clock on the wall and the low sound of swallowing when the kid drank the sickly sweet coffee. When he was done, Adonis stepped back from the chair. He took off the thin gloves he'd put on, threw them in the separate waste bin, washed his hands with dish soap for longer than was necessary. The water ran hot, lifting steam off the granite, and he scrubbed between his fingers with the patience of someone trying to wash off more than blood. He couldn't look at me for the rest of the afternoon. He went out to the garden and stood near the empty trellis until it started getting dark. I didn't go after him. That night, in the car back to Bridgeport, Declan turned his head slightly in my direction and said, "He didn't sleep." 3 words. I looked out the window and didn't answer. The next 2 days passed in silence. Adonis didn't look at me on Monday. I didn't push it. On the Tuesday of the following week, the hospital called. I was in his office upstairs, organizing receipts that didn't look like receipts, when my cell phone buzzed in my hand. The number of the clinic where Maeve was admitted. I stood without saying where I was going, crossed the corridor with the covered painting without looking at it, walked into the guest bathroom, closed the door, and locked it. The nurse was practical. The installment was due in 4 days, not 11. There had been an adjustment in the medication bill that nobody had informed me about. Without the payment, Maeve lost the private room and went into the shared ward, and her recovery would set back again. I said, "Thank you," hung up, and curled up with my back against the door. The cold tile came through the thin blouse and hit my spine like a reprimand. It wasn't a pretty cry. It was the kind where your breath catches and your shoulders shake on their own, without permission. I pressed my mouth into the sleeve of my blazer to keep quiet, and when the wave passed, I washed my face at the sink, fixed my lipstick, and walked back down the corridor with the firm step of a woman who had never been anywhere. Adonis didn't look up from the paper when I came in, didn't comment, didn't ask if I was okay, but his pencil was paused in the middle of a word, and the cup next to his elbow was still full, untouched. I noticed. I didn't say anything. On Friday, I got to the Lincoln Park house at 10 in the morning, my coat damp from the drizzle off the lake. Declan was in the kitchen. He set a brown envelope down in front of me without saying anything, and walked out. Inside the envelope, the receipt for the full payoff of the hospital debt, plus the receipt for the private room paid for 12 months, plus a business card, simple, with the name of the clinic's director, and the handwritten line, "Anything you need, call me direct." I went up the stairs 2 at a time. I crossed the corridor without looking at the covered painting. I knocked on the office door once, and walked in without waiting for an answer. Adonis was sitting behind the dark wood desk, white sleeve rolled up to the elbow, pen in his right hand, the flame ring catching the light from the window. The morning light fell at an angle across the desktop and traced the veins in his forearm. He looked up. I threw the envelope on his desk. "What is this?" He didn't pretend not to know. "Your grandmother's debt." I didn't ask. "I know." I braced both hands on the edge of the desk, leaning forward. I could feel the blood in my face, the heat in my neck, the rage rising from a place much older than this moment. Maeve sick, Donovan in the break room, 4 years of damp blazer, and now a man who paid off a debt without asking. "I am no one's property," I said. My voice came out low, controlled. "I wasn't bought. I am not going to be bought." Adonis put down the pen. He didn't shift in the chair. "I know," he repeated. "Then I want it in writing." He tilted his head a millimeter. "In writing, what? That this money does not turn me into a thing of yours, that I can leave whenever I want, that my grandmother does not become a hostage to your favor, all of it, on paper, signed by you, and with your promise not to come after me." Adonis opened the top drawer, pulled out a pad of stationery with the family crest embossed on it, and pushed it to my side of the desk. "Write," he said. I wrote. His fountain pen was heavier than my hand was used to, and the ink came out darker than it should have. I didn't lift my hand from the paper, trembling, when I was done. I pushed it back. He read one word, maybe two. The rain-colored eyes ran over the paragraph the way you run over something you already know by heart. He signed at the bottom with the fountain pen, in a single unbroken motion, no hesitation. Then he looked up at me. "Write whatever you want," he said low. "I just need you to stay." I locked at the edge of the desk. The sentence hung in the air of the office like a smell I couldn't identify. Old, warm, with the weight of another language. It wasn't an order. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't ownership. It was a request. A request from a rich man used to buying people, I told myself on the walk back down the corridor. A request from someone who needs presence because he can't stand his own silence at the table. A request from a man who pays because he never learned how to ask. I repeated that to myself the rest of the afternoon. And even so, I kept the folded paper in the inner pocket of my bag, alongside Gran's pepper spray. Not in his envelope, in mine. That same Friday, at dusk, I went downstairs to grab the calendar folder I had left in the living room. The terrace door was ajar, and I heard Cassian's voice before I saw him. He was with another man, younger, in a dark suit. The two of them were smoking, leaning on the railing. The smoke rose in slow threads over the wisteria, and the sweet smell of the cigar reached me before the words did. Cassian was laughing softly, the way a grandfather laughs telling a fishing story. "The nephew is losing his head over some secretary," he was saying, in the tone of someone commenting on the weather. "Paid off a hospital debt. Had the receipt sent to the girl before she even walked into the house today. Imagine that." The other man laughed too, shorter. "Things men who've never been told no do, capo. Things men who are afraid of losing do," Cassian corrected. The smile stayed in his voice. "Which is more dangerous." I picked up the folder without making a sound and walked back down the corridor without letting them see me. I climbed the stairs with my heart beating in a different rhythm from the morning's rage. At the top, I stopped in front of the covered painting and, for the first time in 3 weeks, touched the tip of my finger to the black cloth. The fabric was softer than I expected. Worn velvet, almost velveteen from age. Underneath, the frame had a relief I could feel as a cold groove. I didn't lift it. I just touched. When I went back to Bridgeport that night, the folded paper was heavy in the pocket of my bag, and for the first time since the interview, I had the feeling I was being watched from more than one side of the house, not just by the rain-colored eyes of its owner. It was only a feeling. I went to sleep thinking that. Chapter 4. I've already hurt. 6 weeks later, I already knew things about him he had never told anyone. I knew he stayed up until 3 in the morning. I'd hear the floor creak in the study, the leather chair sliding slowly, the soft sound of a drawer being opened and closed, and then the long silence of a man who had stayed there looking at whatever he had taken out. I knew that when he ran his hand over the back of his neck twice in a row, it was because someone was going to die that week. I had crossed the gesture with 3 discreet obituaries in regional papers before I accepted the pattern. I knew he kept an old photograph in the inside pocket of his jacket, because once, mending the lapel of the black coat that had come back from the cleaners with the lining unstitched, I felt the hard corner of photo paper through the fabric and handed the piece back without touching it. I never asked any of that. I read, and I knew he read me too. By the way, the coffee showed up on my desk with 2 sugars before I'd asked. By the way, the stairwell light stayed on when I worked late. By the way, Declan, every day said, "Have a seat, ma'am," before I'd gotten near the passenger door. One Saturday before dawn, I couldn't sleep. I went down barefoot on the service stairs, crossed the empty kitchen, where the oven clock read 2:46, and opened the door to the garden. Adonis was there, standing, his back to the house, looking at the nothing beyond the trellis. White shirt, no jacket, no signet ring on his hand. It must have been left on the desk. His shoulders, without the coat, looked smaller than usual. I went over slowly. The dew on the grass wet the soles of my feet. He knew it was me before I spoke. "You shouldn't be awake, Halloran. Neither should you," I answered. I stopped a meter from him. The garden smelled of wet earth and some flower I couldn't name. Above, one star holding its own against the light pollution of Chicago. "If I asked you something," I said, and the sentence came out before I'd weighed the consequence. "Would you tell me the truth?" He turned his head slowly toward me. His eyes looked darker in the low light of the garden. It took him a while to answer, and when he did, It was as if he had opened a rib in his chest and shown me. Ask. The word hung there, between us, the size of a door. I didn't ask. I looked at the ground, fixed the sleeve of my nightshirt, and took half a step back. Never mind, I said. Another day. Adonis didn't push, didn't comment. He turned his eyes back to the nameless point beyond the trellis, and he stayed like that until I went back up. I sensed on the stairs that he was still breathing slowly, the same as before, as if nothing had passed between us, and precisely because of that, I knew something had. In my room, lying on my back with the white ceiling above me, I understood I was in trouble, not because of the job, not because of the mob, because of the man who had answered ask, as though I had requested his heart on a platter. I wanted him, and that was the most dangerous thing I had ever faced in my life. I went on thinking, that night, that he only saw me as a useful, stubborn secretary. The following Thursday, he asked me to serve at a dinner. Business, said Declan in the car, cutting the explanation as short as possible. Castellano, rival capo. 4 words, Declan. You outdid yourself. He didn't answer, but the corner of his mouth lifted 1 millimeter, and I counted it as a win. The dinner was in a private restaurant in the Loop, a single table in the middle, heavy silverware, a wine whose name I couldn't have pronounced, Adonis at the head, Cassian next to him, smiling, with the linen napkin folded on his knee, Castellano across, a big man, red-faced, his tie loosened before the first course had even started. I served wine, water, bread. I kept my eyes on the glasses, my posture straight, my breathing low. From Adonis, I had learned to eat with my head down. From my grandmother, I had learned to serve with my head up. I knew how to balance the two. Castellano drank fast, talked loud, repeated jokes nobody at the table found funny, and that he himself laughed at. Adonis ate in absolute silence, chewing slowly, his eyes fixed on his plate like a man measuring out his patience in spoonfuls. On the third pass with the wine, when I leaned in to refill Castellano's glass, I felt his hand slide down the side of my hip and stop at my waist. It wasn't an accident. It was possession, the calm of a man used to taking and keeping. The bottle almost slipped from my hand. I gripped it tight. I didn't back away. Adonis set down his fork, set down his knife, set down each item with the precision of a man placing objects on an imaginary table, with the etiquette of someone who'd been corrected as a child. He stood up slowly. He crossed the 2 meters between his chair and Castellano's at no particular hurry, picked up the meat knife, a heavy thing, bone-handled, and pinned the rival capo's wrist against the chair arm. The first thing I heard was Castellano's glass, falling onto the tablecloth, staining the linen burgundy. The second was the sound of the bone breaking, a short, dry snap, with no immediate scream. The scream came after. Castellano was bellowing in Italian, in English, in any language he could form while his wrist hung at the wrong angle. You don't even know whose house you walked into, girl. Castellano spat in my direction, his wrist still pinned, before Adonis leaned in and whispered one sentence in Italian near his ear. I couldn't translate it. But the room emptied. 3 of Castellano's bodyguards who had been against the wall walked out the side door without turning their backs, like men fleeing a fire. Cassian stayed seated, the grandfatherly smile intact, and cut a piece of meat into his own mouth. Aubrey, Adonis said, without turning toward me, get your coat. I got it. In the car back, the silence was a different thickness. Declan was driving. The divider between front and back was closed. I could smell the blood on Adonis's sleeve, not his, the other man's, mixed with the dry scent of the aftershave he wore, and I watched the signet ring slide just slightly when he pressed his fist against his knee. I reached out and touched the back of his hand. It was a small gesture, no weight to it. He pulled back like he'd been burned. He drew his hand to his body, turned his face to the window. You're not going to hurt me, I whispered. It took him a while to answer. When he did, it was lower than the glass had recorded. That's the problem, Halloran. I've already hurt. I spent the night awake, in the Bridgeport apartment, trying to decode the sentence. I concluded it was wounded alpha male pride from a guy who had broken another man's wrist and hadn't known what to do with his own wrist in the car afterward. I concluded it was shame, control, anything but love. I went on concluding that, until 3 days later. It was Sunday. Maeve had been cleared for a weekend out of the clinic, on conditional discharge, and I had done what my grandmother taught me to do every Sunday since I was 7. Fresh bread, soup, wine from a plastic jug, table set in the cramped kitchen of the Bridgeport apartment. Maeve was on the couch, the throw on her lap, commenting on the television show with the sound off. I was stirring the soup on the stove. Outside it was starting to get dark, and the wind off the lake was hitting the window with that air of asking to come in. The downstairs door slammed harder than usual. Maeve turned her face in my direction. I already had the kitchen towel in my hand, and I was already walking toward the entry, before I'd even thought. It was too fast. The apartment door blew open with a kick from outside. 4 men, black and gray, heavy boots. One of them was carrying a short barrel and 2 plastic zip cuffs on his belt. "Gran, bathroom," I said. Maeve was already on her feet, her hand closed against her chest and her breath short, but she crossed the corridor with the stubbornness of a woman who had raised a granddaughter in Bridgeport. I locked the bathroom door from the outside, threw the key into the fern pot, and turned. The ceramic lamp on the entryway table was heavy. It was the lamp my grandmother had bought in a thrift shop 20 years before, with the moss-green base. I picked it up by the stem, swung it like a baseball bat, and brought it down on the head of the first man who came at me. The ceramic exploded. He staggered. The second man grabbed me by the hair, and the third by the ankle. I screamed for the neighbor, Mr. Petrowski, downstairs, who always complained about Maeve's loud TV, and whom on any other Sunday I would have avoided. "Petrowski! Police! Petrowski!" I was dragged by the leg down the narrow corridor. The old carpet made a scraping noise on my back, and every corner of furniture caught between my shoulder blades like the whole house was hitting me back. I caught a glimpse of the closed bathroom door, heard Maeve pounding on the other side, screaming my name in a voice I'd never heard before. They dragged me into the kitchen. The man holding my hair pushed my head down onto the cheap tile. The smell of burnt bread on the stove flooded my nose, along with the smell of new leather from the boot stepping a centimeter from my face. I thought, in a second between 2 punches, about the newspaper ad, about 6 figures, about 4 candidates, about some sentence about dogs. Then the front door blew open for the second time. I heard shots, 3 fast, 1 isolated, and the men on top of me vanished from my field of view in a sharp motion, voices in Italian, boots running. Another shot, farther off, in the corridor, and then silence, and then the slow step. Adonis walked into the kitchen first, covered in blood from the chest down. It wasn't his, I knew, because he was walking normally. The white shirt had turned into something else. The signet ring on his right hand glinted black. Behind him, 2 bodyguards I didn't know, and Declan in the doorframe with his coat open and the gun still low at his thigh. "We had men on duty on the block since the night of the dinner, ma'am," Declan said, without looking at me. "Camera caught movement. We came up in 3 minutes. Adonis saw me on the floor. He looked down the corridor, at the locked bathroom door from which Maeve's pounding was still coming. He dropped to his knees, not in submission, not as a performance. In despair, the kind that empties a man's body all at once. His knees hit the kitchen floor without his bracing himself, and the 2 dirty hands came up to my face before I could move. The thumbs wiped something off my cheek. Blood, tear, I couldn't tell. The rain-colored eyes were closer to my face than they had ever been. "Aubrey," he said, and it was the first time he had called me by my first name. "Look at me, look at me." I looked. I lost my mother this way. His voice was low, broken in a way I had never heard in any man before. At home, on a Sunday, eating. I swore this would never happen again to anyone who mattered to me. The word mattered fell on the kitchen floor along with the ceramic of the lamp. I understood in 3 seconds, 3 things. First, I mattered. Second, I mattered in a way he had sworn over the memory of his own mother, and therefore it wasn't new. Third, the sentence in the car, "That's the problem. I've already hurt," wasn't alpha male pride. It was something else, older, with the weight of a safe. Behind him, Declan opened the bathroom door. Maeve came out, leaning against the doorframe, alive, panting, and saw me on the floor holding the wrist of the Dawn of the Chicago Camorra on the stained tile of my kitchen. My grandmother didn't comment. She just crossed the corridor slowly, knelt on my other side, and placed her hand, cold and dry, over his dirty hand. "Get her out of here, son," Maeve said. Adonis closed his eyes. "Yes, ma'am." And I, on the floor of my own kitchen in Bridgeport, with the smell of burnt bread in my nose, and the flame ring glinting black 3 centimeters from my chin, began to come apart inside. Chapter 5. Sleep Next to Me. The armored car glided through the silent city at 11:40 at night. Maeve slept leaning against my shoulder, exhausted, with the smell of our apartment still caught in the wool coat she had pulled on over her nightgown, a smell of tomato sauce cooling on the stove, of cheap dish soap, of everything that had stopped being ours the moment the door was kicked in. Declan was driving with both hands on the wheel and his eyes on the rear view. No radio on, no questions. Adonis rode in the passenger seat, his back to me, shoulder tense under the stained jacket. Nobody said anything until the Lincoln Park gate opened. The house looked bigger at night, colder without the yellow light of his study on. Declan had already called the clinic director on the way. The on-duty nurse would arrive in an hour, with Maeve's medication and verbal approval to extend the conditional discharge under private supervision. A housekeeper I had never seen, a woman of about 60 with her hair pulled back in a low bun, received Maeve in the entry hall with a clean robe, and my grandmother, before she went up, squeezed my wrist with surprising strength for someone who had spent the last hour locked in a bathroom, listening to her granddaughter being dragged across the floor. "You sleep where you need to sleep, baby," she said low, looking at me. "I'm not asking." I went up behind Adonis. He walked the corridor without turning on any lights, passed the covered painting without looking at it, opened the door to his bedroom, and stood to the side, waiting for me to decide whether I'd go in. The floor creaked under my bare feet, a long sound, almost human, as if the house itself was holding its breath along with me. I went in. The bedroom was simpler than the rest of the house. A wide bed, a charcoal duvet, a leather armchair by the window, a nightstand with a glass of water and nothing else. No photos, no books. None of the man who slept there every night, except for the shirt hanging on the back of the chair, still holding the shape of his shoulders as if he had just walked out of it. I had someone else's blood on my pants. My hands were still shaking, but a different kind of shaking now, slower, as if my body were only now allowing me to feel what had happened in my apartment kitchen. "Sleep next to me," I said. My voice came out steady, and even I was surprised. "Just sleep." Adonis took 3 seconds to answer. The rain-colored eyes went to that place between fear and obedience I had never seen on his face. "I'll sleep on the floor, if you prefer." I didn't prefer that. He nodded slowly, like a man accepting a sentence. He took off the stained jacket, folded it over the armchair, and went into the bathroom to wash his hands. I listened to the water run for a long time, longer than clean hands would need. When he came back, he was in pajama pants and a white t-shirt, barefoot, with the expression of a man who hadn't slept in peace for more years than I knew how to count. I lay down on the window side. He lay down on the other, on top of the duvet, dressed, with an open hand resting centimeters from mine. He didn't touch me. He didn't try. I closed my eyes, thinking I wouldn't be able to sleep. I slept as if someone had cut a current off my body. It went on for 3 weeks like that. He lay down on top of the duvet, always dressed, always in the same position, with his hand open exactly where mine would reach if I stretched out my fingers. I didn't stretch them out. He didn't cross the fabric. We slept like 2 wounded soldiers in the same shelter, aware of each other's breathing, aware of every turn in the dark, and silent about all of it in the morning. I understood by the second week that he wasn't pulling back out of disinterest. He was pulling back because he was afraid of himself. And I, who had spent 4 years in the break room of an office where a man pressed me against a wall telling me I should smile more, I knew how to tell the difference between a man who doesn't want you and a man who forbids himself to want. Adonis forbade himself with the same discipline he ran a meeting, except with me the discipline cost him, and I watched the cost trickle out of the corners of his mouth every time I passed too close. So I started to negotiate, not with my body, with questions. What was her name? It was dark. I was looking at the ceiling. He took so long to answer, I thought he had fallen asleep. Lucia. Neapolitan, I figured. Neapolitan. Silence. His breathing controlled on purpose, like someone holding a door closed with his shoulder. How old were you? 14. I turned my head on the pillow. His profile cut against the bluish light of the window looked like a statue someone had sculpted before the last layer of skin. Why do you eat with your head down? Adonis closed his eyes. I saw the lashes drop, even in the dark, because she used to correct my posture. His voice came lower and seemed to come from another man, younger, with less weight on his back. Every night, at dinner, she'd run her hand between my shoulder blades and say, in Italian, "Shoulders back, love." When I eat, I hear her voice. If I lift my head, I stop hearing it. I didn't answer. I had no answer to give. I stretched my hand a centimeter farther on the duvet without quite touching him, and he noticed, and stayed still for the rest of the night as if one more word might dismantle what we were building bone by bone. Every piece was pulled out. Not given. One night before dawn, I woke up at 3 and he wasn't in bed. I sat up slowly. The bathroom light was off, the whole room dark, and for a second the fear came back. The kind of fear that learns to live in the back of someone who has been dragged across the floor by men she didn't know. Then I found him. Sitting in the armchair by the window, the old photograph open on his lap. Eyes down, his hand on the back of his neck twice in a row. The tic I had learned to dread. But this time there was no one for him to go kill. There was just a woman in a photo, and a 34-year-old man, who was still a 14-year-old boy when he looked at her. The weak light from the street came in at an angle through the curtain and drew half his face in silver, the other half in shadow. The broad shoulders looked like two beams carrying an entire city no one saw. I closed my eyes before he noticed I was awake. I pretended to sleep. I heard his caught breath cross the room, 2 dry cuts in the air, a sob swallowed before it could become sound. I pressed the pillowcase against my mouth to keep from giving myself away. In the morning, neither of us mentioned it. It was on a Wednesday that the news broke. I was in the kitchen when I heard. I had just poured coffee with 2 sugars for mine, black coffee for his, and I took the 2 cups to the living room where Adonis was reading the paper with the TV on low. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air and mixed with the smell of the waxed wood floor of the living room, a warm perfume of a rich man's house I still hadn't gotten used to. The anchor said the Castellano name, Camorra Capo, arrested the night before on an anonymous tip, too detailed to be from just anyone. Undeclared deposits, port routes, photographs of meetings at addresses only an insider would know. The FBI had walked into his apartment at 4 a.m. I set the cups on the coffee table. I looked at Adonis. He kept reading the paper, without moving a muscle in his face, but his right hand, the one holding the paper, turned the page with the calm of a man who had known exactly what he was going to hear before he turned on the television. "It was you," I said. It wasn't a question. Adonis lifted his eyes, the color of rain, no cloud this time. He reached for the remote, turned the TV off, closed the paper, and only then looked at me again. When he spoke, it was without moving his lips more than necessary, and quiet enough to die between the two of us. In this room, and never anywhere else. "Yes. You're telling me you handed a capo over to the FBI. For me. For your safety. The difference?" He didn't answer. "You burned a whole capo down to take the threat off me. Don't say that out loud again, Halloran. Not even here." He said it the way you'd confirm the weather forecast, but his eyes swept the room once before going back to the paper. I stood in the middle of the living room, not knowing whether I was supposed to thank him, whether I was supposed to be scared, whether I was supposed to understand that this man had, for me, done something men like him don't do for anyone. The air in the room turned dense suddenly, a long silence in which all you could hear was the tick of the wall clock behind me and his low breathing. That was when I heard Cassian's voice in the side corridor, low, on the phone. I walked past without making a sound. He had his back turned, talking to someone in Italian, and at some point switched to English, the grandfatherly smile intact in his voice. "The nephew burned an entire capo down for a woman." Cassian laughed softly. A short laugh, smooth, almost affectionate. God have mercy. I froze behind the corner of the wall. Adonis hadn't heard. He was in the living room, with the TV on, the paper open. I heard, and I held on to it. At the time I didn't know why I was holding on to it. I only knew that sentence said in that tone, in the garden of that house, carried the weight of a warning. I went back to the coffee table, picked up my cup, sat down next to Adonis on the couch, and drank the coffee with 2 sugars watching the news. He ran his hand over the back of my neck once, slowly, and this time, it was affection, not announcement. His fingers were warm and careful, and they stayed a second longer than they needed to, as if he too needed to prove to himself that he could touch me without hurting. The following Saturday, I went to see Maeve. Adonis had set my grandmother up in an apartment near the hospital, 3 rooms, bright, with a caregiver during the day and a nurse on call. I had found out from the housekeeper, standing in the kitchen with a cup in my hand, and had taken a whole night to decide whether it made me angry or whether I should be ashamed I wasn't angrier. In the end, it was both. But Maeve was better, and I had already learned that with that man, fighting over a grand gesture was fighting too late. He had already done it. Declan drove me. 4 words in the car. "She's better, ma'am." Maeve was in the armchair by the window, the sun on her lap, and a cup of nearly cold tea in her hand. Her eyes, when she saw me come in, were lucid in a way I hadn't seen for months. I sat on the little stool next to the armchair. I took her hand. Thin paper skin with dark spots, with my grandfather's wedding band that she had not taken off in 40 years. The smell of chamomile tea, sweet and tired, rose between the two of us like a third presence in the room. We sat in silence for a few minutes. Then she squeezed my fingers. She squeezed hard, and she looked at me with those eyes of someone who had been holding on to something for too long. "Your mother wasn't bad, baby." I locked. Maeve hadn't talked about my mother in years. I had buried that name at 6, 7 years old. A woman who disappeared. A door no one opened again. A portrait turned face to the wall in the corridor of the house in Bridgeport. "Gran, she just didn't have a choice." Maeve's voice came out steady, with no tremor. "I need you to know that, in case I forget later." I looked at her. The sun came into her face, and I saw, for the first time in a long time, the woman who had raised me. Not the patient in the private room paid for by the year, but the Maeve Halloran, who had buried a husband, raised a granddaughter, and kept secrets she thought she would take with her to the grave. "Okay, Gran," I said low. "Okay." I chalked it up to early dementia. It was easier. I straightened the throw on her lap, kissed her forehead, changed the subject, asked if she wanted me to bring the little cakes from the bakery on the corner next Saturday. She said yes, smiled, and closed her eyes in the sun. I left that apartment with the sentence hammering inside my chest, in a dry, repeated rhythm, like footsteps on a wooden stair. "Your mother wasn't bad. She just didn't have a choice." Declan was waiting, leaning on the car. He looked at me, took me in, and let out 4 words with the same economy as always. "You're pale, ma'am." "I'm fine, Declan." "You're pale." I got in the car without answering. I looked at the roof of the car the whole way back to Lincoln Park, and for the first time in 3 weeks I did not think about Adonis. I thought about my mother, about a woman whose smell, face, voice I couldn't remember, about a woman who, according to Maeve, had not had a choice. And I thought, without meaning to think it, about the painting covered by the black cloth in the corridor of the house I was going back to. That cloth I walked past every day without touching. That cloth Adonis never looked at directly, but always angled his shoulder around, like a man avoiding a place where he had already been wounded. The storm started building over Chicago as the car pulled into Lincoln Park. Thunder far off, but coming. Chapter 6. Stop Pulling Back From Me. The power went out at the house at 11:30 at night. I was in Adonis's bedroom, alone, with the window open because the air was heavy with rain coming. I could smell the soil in the garden rising in waves, that dense smell of wet root that always comes before the first thunderclap, and the wind was already moving the hem of the curtain in light little flicks against the wall. Adonis had gone downstairs an hour earlier, after a quick call in Italian I hadn't understood, and he hadn't come back yet. Maeve had asked to spend the night in the guest room on the lower floor. She said the high wind was good for her lungs, and I didn't argue. The thunder cracked. The whole house went dark. I have always been afraid of thunder. Not pretty fear, the little girl tucked into her father's lap-getting chocolate kind. Ugly fear, from when I was 4, when I slept alone in the Bridgeport bedroom for the first time, and thought the sky was collecting on a debt I didn't know I had. Maeve found out the next morning that I had spent the night under the bed with the blanket stuffed in my mouth, and I still kept somewhere in my chest the reflex of that child who had learned too early that nobody comes for you in the dark. I got up, barefoot. The thin nightgown brushed my knee, and the wood of the floor was cold in a way that climbed straight up my ankles. I felt for the nightstand, found the candle the housekeeper had left, found the matches. I struck one. The flame trembled, steadied, threw on the ceiling a trembling shadow in the shape of an oversized bird. I opened the bedroom door. The corridor was black. The candle drew yellow circles on the walls. On the old portraits of the Vance family I had never had the courage to look at head-on. On the vases on the chests. I walked slowly, cold feet on the wood, going around the furniture I already knew by heart after 3 weeks sleeping in that house. Every board had its own sound, and I already knew which creaked and which didn't. A silent cartography I had picked up without meaning to, the same way I had picked up his silence at the table. I found him standing in front of the covered painting. Adonis had a candle in his hand too, the white shirt open at the first 3 buttons, jacket off, barefoot like me. He was standing in front of the black cloth without touching it, without lifting it, without doing anything, just looking, the way you look at a closed door from inside another closed door. His flame rose and fell in the rhythm of his breathing, and there was a stillness there that seemed to have age, as if that man had crossed his whole life to arrive standing in that exact piece of corridor. His candle lit my face when I came close. He turned. "You should be asleep." The power went out. I know. I'm afraid of thunder, He looked at me a long time. His mouth moved to say something, but didn't. He stepped back half a step, instinctive, like he had stepped back 21 straight nights on top of the duvet. The same half step, always the same, as if that centimeter were the last territory he could still defend from himself. That was when I understood it would have to be me. I moved in. I pinned him against the wall by the painting, candle in my right hand, the left on his chest over the shirt, feeling his heart push through the fabric with a violence he didn't let show anywhere else in his body. It was the only part of him that lied poorly. Shoulders, jaw, breathing, all controlled. The heart, no. Stop pulling back from me, I whispered. Adonis closed his eyes. Aubrey, I know what I'm choosing. He opened his eyes. The color of rain, and the rain had really arrived. I could see deep in them, the reflection of the candle tremble, and behind the reflection a tiredness that wasn't from one night. It was from a life. You don't know, he said low. I swear you don't know. Then teach me later. I set the candle on the little console in the corridor. I rested my forehead against his. Tonight, stop pulling back. I kissed him. It wasn't a question. It was a decision made by a woman who had spent 4 years swallowing things worse men had put in her mouth, and was finally putting something into someone's mouth by her own choice. His lips were warm and still, and for a second I thought he was going to push me away, and then he gave in. He gave in completely. His hand came up to the back of my neck with the calm of a man who had trained 20 years for that exact gesture. The other found the middle of my back and pulled me to him without rush, without weight, as if he were still afraid of breaking me. I held his face in both hands. I felt the 3-day stubble in my palm, rough in one place, softer in another, and the heat of his skin coming up under mine as if his body had just remembered it was a body. I felt his forehead surrender against mine, and that, more than the kiss, more than the hand on my neck, was what undid me. That a man who carried the weight of an entire city had for 2 seconds rested his head on me. The candle on the console went out from a draft that came from the open window below. We stood in the absolute black of the corridor. Adonis took my hand. His palm was warm, calloused at a specific point on the index finger, and his fingers closed on mine with a firmness that was both request and promise at once. I pulled his into the bedroom. The door closed behind us, and the thunder cracked again on the other side of the window, and I didn't hear it. I woke to the sun coming in at an angle on the corner of the duvet. The window was open, the morning air clean the way it only is after a storm, washed, cold at the edges, with that smell of freshly beaten garden that seems to promise a different life, and the bed on his side was empty. The sheet still held the print of his body, a warm hollow at the shoulder, and his white shirt, the same one I had taken off his shoulders at some point between the corridor and the bed, was thrown over my legs as if he had left it there on purpose. I put it on over the nightgown. The buttons only went halfway up. The fabric smelled like him. Sandalwood, old coffee, something metallic and sweet I never managed to name. I went downstairs barefoot. The house smelled like coffee. I found Adonis in the kitchen, his back to me, pajama pants again, white t-shirt again, barefoot again, but with a posture I had never seen in that body, shoulders down, the weight gone out of somewhere in the middle of his back. He was stirring sugar into a mug with a small spoon, slowly, in circular, almost domestic motions, and even from the back I knew he was smiling. How many? I asked. 2, with declared disgust. He turned. His smile was new. I had never seen that one. Good morning, Halloran. He said it in a way that sounded like the first time he was saying good morning to anyone in his life, and maybe it was. I didn't ask. I crossed the kitchen, feeling the cold tile under my feet, took the mug from his hand, took the first sip. Too hot, too sweet, perfect, and he pulled me by the waist without ceremony and kissed my temple. Has Maeve come down? She's in the garden. Ate 3 slices of bread and said I don't know how to make eggs. I laughed. I laughed out loud. I laughed alone. I laughed the way I had forgotten I laughed. The sound came out full, without guilt, and hung in the air of the kitchen 1 second longer as if even it were surprised to exist. Adonis watched me the way you watch something you didn't expect to be able to see, and his hand stayed on my waist as if it were afraid that, by letting go, it would find out it had dreamed all of it. The afternoon was a piece I hadn't known still existed. Maeve had lunch with us at the garden table, color in her cheeks for the first time in months, a steady hand on the fork, telling stories about my grandfather I hadn't heard in years. The wisteria spilled over the brick wall in a tired June purple, and there was a stubborn bee insisting on circling my grandmother's juice glass, and I sat there, watching the scene, with the odd sense of someone who arrives somewhere, and finds out she has already lived there in another life. Adonis ate with his head down, the way he did, but at some point between the salad and the second course, he lifted his eyes, looked at Maeve, and asked in Italian if she wanted more wine. Maeve answered in English that what she wanted more of was him learning how to make eggs. Adonis laughed. A short laugh, but a real one. The kind of laugh that comes from a place he had locked away so long ago he had forgotten the key. And I saw my grandmother brush her hand lightly between his shoulder blades, the way no mother had done in 20 years. He closed his eyes for half a second. I pretended I was looking at something else, because some gestures need to be seen without a witness. Sloane sent a 40-second voice note. I listened with earbuds, lying in the grass, and she was screaming, "Hal, I'm dead. I'm dead. He put his arm around your waist in a photo that leaked to the society column. Girl, it ran in the Sun-Times. This is historic." I laughed so hard Adonis called over from a distance to ask if I wanted him to kill anyone. I said no, not yet. He laughed again, seated in the iron chair, swirling his glass by the stem, and the sound came slowly across the garden, low and a little hoarse. I went up to the bedroom in the afternoon to grab a blouse. The window was open, and the wind was still carrying the wet smell of the grass. On the nightstand, the contract he had signed without reading was lying there, forgotten, in the same corner where I had thrown it weeks earlier, the corner already creased from lack of care. I sat on the edge of the bed, more out of curiosity than for any reason, and opened it. It was too much legalese, words I didn't feel like processing on a sunny Saturday. Heir consort, tradition of the house. My eyes passed over, registered, didn't stop. The paragraphs coiled in Latin and overlong commas, and there was a signature at the end that was his, firm, no hesitation, as if he had memorized every letter before even picking up the pen. I closed the paper, and I thought, for just 2 seconds, why was this so important to him? It was a short thought, a grain of sand among all the other thoughts I had had that morning about coffee, about Maeve, about the smell of the shirt I was wearing, about the barefoot man who had laughed in the kitchen for the first time in 20 years. A grain, so small it slipped between my fingers before I could even close my hand. Adonis came up the stairs. I heard the bare footsteps in the corridor before he appeared in the doorway with 2 cups in his hand, his hair still damp from a man who had washed his face at the kitchen sink. "One more?" he asked, showing the coffee. I closed the contract, put it back on the nightstand, with the same offhandedness I had picked it up with. I held out my hand. "One more." He sat next to me on the bed, and the mattress sank slightly under his weight, pressing his hip against mine. He handed me the cup. He kissed my temple, slowly, the way he had learned to kiss in the morning, as if each kiss were a word in a language he was inventing as he spoke it. The question evaporated in the next second, along with the steam from the coffee, along with the smell of bread that was still rising from the kitchen, along with the sound of Maeve's voice in the garden, telling another story about my grandfather. Outside, the sun was high over Lincoln Park. Castellano was in prison. Maeve was stable. The debt was paid. And I was there, with his shirt open at my chest, drinking coffee with 2 sugars next to the most feared man in Chicago, who that afternoon was just a barefoot man who had learned to smile. Everything was at peace. Lena here. That wraps up book 1, and I've already finished book 2. You can get access to it for a really small fee. I stopped looking for danger the day I started sleeping in his arms. Adonis made the coffee before I woke up. Cup on the left, 2 spoons of sugar, my name whispered as if I were his property. In Lincoln Park, the whole house seemed to breathe more calmly when he touched me. I smiled. I kissed his temple. I thought I had finally been chosen. Until that morning. Until I threw the 3 pages on the counter and saw his face stay absolutely calm. No surprise. No guilt. Just the look of a man who had been waiting for this moment for years. He knew. About my mother being alive. About the contract that sold me at 6 years old. About every step I'd taken thinking I was free. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't give him the pleasure of watching me come apart. I just grabbed my bag and walked out the kitchen door. But before I reached the gate, I felt his hand seize my arm with enough force to leave a mark. He pulled me back, set his mouth against my ear, and said low, almost tenderly, "You're not going anywhere, Halloran." The danger had never been outside. He had been sleeping next to me this whole time. And now, he was never going to let me leave. Like I said, that was just a taste of book 2. To watch it uncensored, Just click on the first link here in the pinned comment. I'll see you on the other side in a few seconds. Remember, just click on the first link down here in the comments, and Book 2 complete, no ads, no interruptions, will already be available for you. It's very simple. Book 2 is something I'm loving making. You're loving it too, so I promise there will be more. It's where you find increasingly spicy stories, a true dark romance. And precisely because this version is getting more and more heated, the video isn't well accepted publicly on YouTube. This closed environment is where I can actually share my essence and where I feel free to do my best work for you. More news coming soon. I'll be waiting for you on the other side. Congratulations! Your purchase has been confirmed, and you now have full access to books 1 and 2 of all our stories, completely ad-free and uninterrupted. Everything is available on the My Stories platform, from Mafia romance and billionaire romance to our spicier tales. This content is ready for you now, with new episodes added daily. Access is simple. Just log in using the same email address you used for your purchase. A confirmation has also been sent to that same email. The My Stories platform is very simple and intuitive. Each image represents a story. If it has a book 2, just click and press play. Everything is already unlocked for you. You can also rate each story, leave a like, and write a comment. Your feedback will be visible to all our other subscribers. This is our romance universe, so please feel free to interact. From this moment on, this is officially your home for romance stories.